on behalf of UNDP, welcome back. And I think you know who I am. I was in this morning's panel session. I'm Poon Wang from the LKYCIC Center for Innovative Cities. I'll be moderating this next session. And besides the cocktail food, there was a treat. You're in for another treat now, which is the intellectual one. We've got Kok Yam here, who's been looking at the Smart Nation journey from the beginning. We were just joking outside that Kok Yam was there when it was a guerrilla outfit of about 10 people just rolling up their sleeves to get the work done. And now it's going into a gorilla outfit, right? They still roll up their sleeves, but now they have to roll up their trousers to make sure they move faster. So maybe without much more further ado, let me just invite Kok Yam up to share his journey and his experiences looking at Singapore's Smart Nation initiative and journey. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here. I really look forward to the exchange of ideas that will come later. I will try to keep my presentation a little bit short, a little bit brief, and a bit informal, because it's just a lead up to hopefully the very exciting exchange that we'll have later. Okay, you have been spending the last hours discussing this, so I shall not belabor on this point. Basically, hang on a minute. Why we are here talking about disruption? There is an economic reason to this. Computing, the cost of compute power, the cost of putting a chip on everything has fallen so low that basically everything can be connected. Information can be connected, people can be connected, now things can be connected. And when everything is connected, you get new social business models, new ways of doing things, new ways of booking a hotel booking a place to stay in Tokyo, new ways of getting a cab to come here. And what you get from that is a tsunami of data, because everything has a trace, everything has a digital record. That's not particularly interesting unless you're able to do something with the data. And so alongside the falling cost of computing, you have rising computational power that you can apply. You can use data as an asset, and that in itself allows for more social and business models to be built. Consider how, for example, WhatsApp is free. You pay for it, of course. You pay for it with the data that you provide. And that in itself is good enough to fuel and sustain essentially a free service. This is this virtuous cycle of creating digital means of doing things, having the data collected because it's becoming digitized, and then using the data itself to create new value. This is the part that this virtuous cycle is the one that really, I think, is causing the disruption all over in different sectors, making us review our business models in many, many different areas, including government, of course. So to this cycle of disruption, for Singapore, the Smart Nation initiative, the Smart Nation flag is really our national response. And as the Prime Minister puts it, he's been saying this since the beginning when we launched this. This is not about technology play. Fundamentally, it is about using technology, but it's about using it to enable people to realize their ambitions, is to enable citizens to live meaningful and fulfilled lives. So really, it's technology, but it's technology towards an end. The first thing that we want to consider when we look at how to change, to sort of turn this ambition of using technology at a national level effectively to realize fulfilled lives, meaningful lives, is we look at the key components of an action plan that will allow this to happen. So the first part of this is digital infrastructure and data. When you look at infrastructure today, you consider the things that the state must build, roads, lampposts, maybe, things like that, schools, for instance. And there is an equivalent in the digital world. the infrastructure that we must lay out to identify ourselves on the digital platform, to transact, to do payment transactions, and to do data transactions, to inform one another, to exchange information. And then you look at digital capabilities, whether these are capabilities to build and to create, whether these are capabilities to use, to buy and use the technology, and whether these are capabilities to bridge the difference between the technologies and the user. But finally, and most importantly, and it goes back to what the Prime Minister said, it is about realizing digital impact. And we look at it in 3 domains: digital government, what we can do to improve the services that government provides; economic transformation across the wider economy, as well as a digital society, which I will talk about a little bit later. So let me start with digital infrastructure. We've identified 3 areas: a digital identity framework, a payment framework, and really a data exchange framework. And we think these are the key pieces of infrastructure that we need to put in place to enable pervasive use of digital means in society, in economy. We are working on a national digital identity. In Singapore, what we have now is what we call SingPass. And SingPass is a common identity authentication mechanism for the citizen to engage government. So any government agency, with very few exceptions, if you want to engage with a government agency, transact, you use the SingPass. So what we are going to do now is to expand this to other kinds of transactions. So whether it's people to government or people to business, we use the same national digital identity. And we believe that this framework, this national digital identity framework, will allow for savings in terms of enterprise savings, as well as create opportunities for new innovations. In terms of e-payments, we are building putting in place the ingredients for an interoperable e-payments system. We've just launched PayNow, which is a platform to allow interbank payments across the different banks in Singapore. And we believe that this is again a key ingredient in a digital in a smart nation. And the last part is about secure data exchange. Over the past few years, we've been pushing for open data, government sharing its data with society, with companies. But this goes beyond that. It's about creating a platform to allow for exchange of data. We have MyInfo. I think the press release was just out. We have a MyInfo initiative in which we allow for consent-based exchange of information from a government agency to say a private sector institution. We start with a few banks for pilot. So these are the set of digital infrastructure that we think we should put in place for Smart Nation. What about digital capabilities? The first set of digital capabilities is about building, about creating. In government, we have, over the past years, we have invested in building organic capabilities in data science and in software development and several other digital areas. This is to allow ourselves to be more agile in terms of building the applications, the digital solutions to serve the public. But it extends beyond government. It's also definitely about the capabilities within industry to build, and also within our research institutions to support digital applications. The second is capabilities to buy, and I use it in a loosely to mean being the capabilities of being a smart user. So one of the things, in addition to grooming a group of data scientists in government, we are also embarking on what I would think is a more ambitious effort to make sure that the general public servant is trained, has a certain understanding of data analytics, how it applies to policy work, how it applies to what they do on a daily basis in terms of looking at operations management and so on. And the idea is not to make them algorithmic experts. The idea is to allow them to have the background, to look at the policy issue at hand, and to ask how I can turn this into a, how I can apply a data-driven approach. What is the information that I require, and who are the data scientists, who are the analysts that I should engage to allow for this data-driven approach. The final capability is about bridging. This is about translational capabilities. There is, in the digital realm, as you will know, there is there's a lot of innovation going on. Some at the business end, some at the research, at the knowledge, at the algorithmic end, so to speak. And oftentimes the key to success is to be the first to market, the first to be able to implement this. So the idea of being able to bridge something that is done in the lab, that is done on a person's laptop, that is done at small scale, and be able to bridge that and to turn it into a large-scale pilot, to turn it into something suitable for deployment is a key capability that we want to build within our ecosystem as well. The final point is digital impact, and let me just elaborate on this a little more. The first, obviously, is digital government. So we see three components of this. At one level, it is about something that's very, very visible to the public. It's about having a service and delivering it to the public in digital mode. And it's not just about a one-to-one translation of a physical service becoming a digital service. One example is, I'm sure many cities and many countries have an equivalent of that. One example is the One Service app that we rolled out. Basically, any municipal issue, one app to handle it. Take a photo of, I don't know, the fallen lamppost, the dead rat clogging up the drain, and the correct agency at the back end will deal with it. So that's an example of a direct translation of a few services into one app to serve the citizen better. But there are also applications of digital to government for which the end user, for which might not be so evident to the end user, but is nonetheless significant and important. And the key part, one key part is about being able to marshal the information, marshal analytics and artificial intelligence to just run the city better, to just be able to know when buses are coming late, to know when there's a safety and security issue, to know when there's a municipal, to know how to reallocate resources on a daily basis to deal with the problems of managing a city. And those are operational applications. It may not be very evident to the citizen that it benefits, but these are nonetheless important applications of digital in government. The last one is a little bit like city management, but it's more long-term, and this is about policy and planning. Being able to take a longer loop view of the data that you collect, being able to gather information together from different agencies. This is Gemma. Gemma is a land planning tool that different agencies in Singapore have come together to contribute information. So there is a common platform for agencies to sit down and figure out, if I put a bus stop here, what will happen to the footfall there, and so on and so forth. But the idea is to be able to have a common platform to do some of these planning activities. And it extends beyond land planning. It extends to policy making in the social realm, in the economic realm as well. So this is digital government. The second aspect is economic transformation. And we break this into two pieces. The first is about enterprise effectiveness, enterprise efficiency. It used to take $40 to $60 maybe to onboard a customer, because it's all this, perhaps the way to onboard a customer requires hard copy documentation, requires labor and staff to to go through the documents and so on. But with, if I can digitize the process, then there will be enterprise efficiency to be reaped. And in the case of Singapore, because we do have an aging population, we have a limited base of to be employed. So this is quite productivity savings is an important element aspect for us. But the second one, which is the less quantifiable aspect, is about open innovation. So once I have a national digital identity framework, for instance, and I allow different companies, startups, established companies, it doesn't matter, to come together, to come and to use that same architecture to create new revenue streams, to create new digital products, or to reinforce their existing physical products. There will be value creation of a sort that we may not even predict or forecast or plan ahead. I mean, these are a bunch of apps that we would not have done ourselves, except that we have released our data as open data to the public. So they come out with all these apps. So similarly, in the private sector, in terms of applications, revenue generating channels, and so on, we believe that having open platforms will allow for that additional value creation. The final point is about digital society. And again, we see, it may be a bit simplistic, but there are two parts to this. The first is really about the idea of inclusiveness. And in a population, in a demographic, I guess different segments will respond to the pace of digitization in different ways. And we want to be very clear that we move together as a population, that we are able to keep all young and old in the digital loop, allowing them to benefit from digital innovations. But beyond that, it's also about digital involvement. It's about part of this. A lot of this journey is about empowering the individual. First, to look after himself, to make better decisions for himself. In this case, the yellow, this yellow bit here is, this yellow part here is an app that we roll out to encourage people to monitor their steps, to create a game, to gamify it so that people walk more, and in the hope that they will exercise regularly and so on. And we create little rewards to encourage people to do that. And this is very much a part about empowering people to make better decisions for themselves. But it's also about enabling people to contribute on the digital platform. So the MyResponder app is a platform that allows for volunteers who know CPR to respond immediately to cases where there's a casualty and their knowledge of CPR is required. It's much better. It allows for that connection. And it allows for the ability for CPR services, so to speak, to be democratized and for us to be able to respond much faster to cases of emergency by tapping on citizens, by tapping on individuals contributing to it. So this is my last slide, and I just have a list of questions targeted at administrators like myself about issues that we grapple almost every day in terms of pushing the digital pace. So the first question is, IT can be costly, and how, as a government with a fixed fiscal budget, responsible to the taxpayers, how do we afford this on a long term? We know that it will pay for itself. At least we hope that it will pay for itself and more. But how do I sustain this? What is my revenue model, so to speak? The second question is, how do we disrupt ourselves? We as government, we have certain organizational structures. The way we divide our resources, the way we divide our roles and responsibility is along organizational lines. But the truth about IT now is that it makes a mockery of our existing device. some data collected by one agency is best used by another agency. And the skills to be able to analyze those data is yet in a third agency. So how do we disrupt ourselves in terms of looking at how do we reorganize ourselves to work in this more seamless environment? The last point is about, actually it brings the disruption question a bit broader. It's actually about, in fact, whether government itself can be disrupted, whether a lot of the things that we do as the government can be crowdsourced, can use the power of the crowd. I think there was something about using an internet of hands to be able to allow citizens and the public to serve themselves and to serve others better. So I think these are the three questions that I put down. I've finished my presentation, and thank you. Yeah, sure.
So thank you, Kok Yam. What we're going to do next is we're going to just invite all the session leads from the breakout sessions to join Kok Yam on stage. And while they're coming up, maybe I'll just explain how we'll do this. Each of the session leads will reflect briefly on what they saw during the breakout sessions, and they'll share on what they see are useful ideas that they could take back as you go back to your home countries and home cities. Right? And then after that, we'll open up the floor for Q&A, and that will take us all the way to the top of the hour. Right, so just in case you didn't get a chance to go to all the breakout sessions, Jane here is Jane Thomason, CEO of About Associates Australia. Peter Lovelock, who is the Director and Founder of Technology Research Project Corporate. I've got Walter there, who is the Evangelist and Government Relations Leader for Global Safety Division of NEC. And I'm just wondering where Victor is. Is he at the breakout room, maybe getting started early on the... Okay, disruptive. Oh, there you go. All right, okay, and we have Victor here, who's the founder and co-managing director of Innovator SG. So we're complete. Right, so maybe what I'll do is, maybe I can start off by getting Jane to share for about 5 minutes some reflections from the breakout session.
Thanks very much. We were the breakout session on identity, data, cybersecurity, and related matters. We had 3 really fantastic panellists with quite complementary experience and skill sets, which was really helpful in terms of the kind of dialogue that we got going with the audience. And the audience were very engaged. I guess the first kind of set of topics that we really got involved in was talking about around, what government can do to protect the data, protect itself in this new digital world. And that got into quite a detailed discussion that merged onto cybersecurity and the dark web and how safe are we really all going to be and will we get kidnapped at some point. But moving back to what government can do, I think the key point that the panellists made were that government can do a whole range of things to protect itself in terms of systems, although as fast as government has systems to protect itself, someone's going to hack that or invent a new way for it not to be secure. So it's got to be, rapidly evolving, and there's not going to be one system put in place that you just then leave it. Secondly, a lot of the risks to government are around human behaviour. So people not looking after their passwords properly, people taking data out of secure systems and maybe putting it on their Gmail because it's more easier for them to do it, or giving all their identity information away to buy a piece of pizza. So a lot more proactivity on the part of government to really educate people about cybersecurity and safety and so forth. We then went on for quite a long discussion around cybersecurity and how complex it is, and that kind of balance between government saying, well, how do we make sure the data is secure, and then the panel saying, well, it's already not secure. Everyone pretty much knows everything that you do, and every time that you touch a mobile phone or a computer, then someone's monitoring and tracking this. And so I think that was disconcerting for a number of the people in the audience who hadn't thought about this. And then how do governments help themselves? How do they get ready for this? And there were some good ideas coming out of that, which perhaps the UN and others could take forward. And one is maybe some government-to-government discussions for emerging economies with countries where the government's actually like Singapore or like Canada or United Kingdom or the Eastern European countries where they've got a lot of government implementation so that governments can talk to governments about it. The second issue is kind of due diligence and credentialing of technology and technology providers and advisors, because if you're an uninformed government about the technology, it's hard for you to know who you're talking to. So I think some assistance with that. And then thirdly, some assistance with education, socialisation, getting greater understanding about technologies and what are the use case applications for government and where could and should government start. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jane. I was at a session, and I thought one of the interesting things that came up was that, we asked why people don't secure their data better. And then somebody from Cashew said, you know what, every time somebody chooses not to give more data, we think that person is up to no good. So, at the same time, asking people to secure the data, at the same time, we think something is wrong if you don't give us your data. So I think there's a cultural and behavioral element that we need to look into, which makes for a very interesting conversation. Right, great. So, Victor, over to you.
Well, in our session, we looked at various practical projects within analytics and automation space. We saw how, within the reality of emerging markets where less data is available, we can still run valuable analytics projects. We looked at how, for example, New Zealand transformed its approach towards analytics for social services. We also saw what goes behind ordering pizza through a chatbot and how a self-driving car sees the world, which was rather interesting. I think a few interesting questions emerged. One around the barriers to why public service or public sector is not necessarily deploying the maximum potential of these technologies and methodologies. There were a few answers, one being that, interestingly enough, the public sector is less trusted than, for example, Facebook and Tinder with handling and merging people's data, which is to be tested, but I do believe that there's an issue coming around that. Another thing being the ability of public sector to attract and retain the talent necessary for building the infrastructure and building the applications that can help. Interesting enough, Singapore is, looking at surveys, one of the top, or at least government institutions are amongst the top preferred employers when it comes to, for example, engineers and data scientists, but that's not common around the world. For most people within the field, those organizations are slow and boring and not motivating and a good career choice, which is a big problem for transitioning and transforming. Professor Leong made another very good remark, like, for example, there's a cultural component, which is something I subscribe to personally quite a bit. Digital transformation is not about technology, it's about organizational structures and culture. Working with data and making data-driven decision-making is about discipline and about organizational culture as well. And we ventured into many other interesting conversations. I don't think I'll have time to summarize, so I'll hand over.
There will be chances to speak a little bit more later. Peter.
Thank you very much. The session that we were in was connectivity and infrastructure, and we had two specialists on cloud computing to do a deep dive on a 101 version of cloud computing, with the upshot being to that point, the cloud will be everywhere and cloud will generate much of what we're doing. The conversations themselves were fascinating. connectivity is fundamentally important was a question and a remark that kept coming up. It's the basic to everything that is being discussed here today, and a recognition that the infrastructure is changing with these disruptive technologies and has changed the economics of growth and development that we're all experiencing. But then some interesting questions and points in response came up to each of those. With all of these disruptive technologies, why are so many people still not connected? So if we've got so much success and we're seeing so much driving through, why are so many of us still not connected, and why is government not doing a better job? Why are governments not doing a better job of driving out that connectivity? Cloud computing increasingly is becoming the infrastructure that we're looking to, particularly for governments and other agencies to be able to go back to focusing on what their strengths are and what they should do. It's a movement away from being technology specialists to being governance specialists. But there's a lot that hasn't been properly thought through in that journey. We have cloud-first frameworks out there, and we don't have procurement frameworks that go along with that, for example. So there's still a lot of work and thinking that needs to go through the governance journey we need to for these new infrastructures. And then along with that, why do so many governments seem to be wary of or worried about cloud, which we discussed from a few different angles, the idea of data protection, data sovereignty, and these issues that keep coming up, and yet so many of them are interested in blockchain and have blockchain initiatives going on, where blockchain is, as I think Tony made the point once or twice, an ideal cloud computing case. Also, is there a trade-off between regulation and innovation disruption? As we bring these disruptive technologies and these innovations into being, and we start providing the frameworks which people tend to initially think of as regulation, which I think is a hanging question we still need to talk about. Do you automatically have a trade-off with disruption? Is there some price that you pay there, and how do we best handle that issue? Secondly, because that was all one bucket, how to use connectivity to get closer to citizens. How are we not only looking at the connectivity question in and of itself, but how should we be doing this now for emerging economies to get closer to citizens? And that was put in a terrific way, one of the best questions I've heard in a long time. How to better use connectivity to delight the people, which I thought was a wonderful way of encapsulating the question. Third, how does the UI of the future look? What will it look like, the user interface? And the answer that came back was one of inclusivity and ubiquity, that technologists tend to be bad at inclusiveness, and the more the UI becomes pervasive, the more we're seeing this be the pathway onto inclusiveness. But there's an issue there with the Cortanas and the Siris and the Alexas, you walk into the house and you speak to the wall or the TV or the bathroom mirror to get the response and the programming and the appointments made. What's the flip side of that ubiquitous aspect, and where does that become a problematic line? And then finally, given we've done all of this talk about the interplay of infrastructure and the options we have with disruptive technologies for driving connectivity, where was quantum computing on the infrastructure roadmap? What will that mean for the infrastructure question, and what does that mean in terms of competition?
Thank you, Kim Wang. The panel discussion that I had was very interesting. I think it's a preparation for the end of the day. It's IoT and Smart Nation. So we had a very interesting discussion. I must thank my fellow panelists, Ted and Paul, for sharing many interesting contents, and also the participation from all the international delegates. 3 letters came out. First letter is M, money. Where do we get money to build all this crazy stuff, all this smart infrastructure? And after building it, where is the money? I mean, where is the economic benefit coming out of it? So we cannot run away from this subject of money makes the world go round, right? The second letter that keep coming out is the letter A, adoption. How do we get citizenry, end users to adopt the solutions that we are talking about? And last is the letter D. It's all about the data. Data is power, but when I put that down in my notes, it became MAD. So a smart nation can be a very mad idea because we lost focus on the last letter. It should be P. We discussed about, it should be about the person. It should be about the citizenry. That we're devising services and support and capabilities at the end of the day, not for the technology, not for the disruption, but to enhance the life of the citizens. So if we were to focus on the person, the personal privacy, the personal protection, and all the government policy that need to support the rights of the individual, then it's not a mad initiative, but we have a roadmap.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you to the session leads for your reflections. I thought one of the things that came out across from all the sharing, including Kok Yang's presentation, is really the question, how do you bring everyone along with you? Right? At the government level, you've got to bring all your agencies along with you. You've got to get people to adopt, you've got to have PPP, and then you've got to get the citizens to come along. So I thought I'll kick off the Q&A by asking Kok, which is something he's been working on for several years, is how did you get all the other agencies to come along for the ride? And then after that, open up to everyone else for Q&A.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. I think it's not as if I have the map to this question, but I think I'll try to answer it with in a way that is in order of increasing difficulty, or maybe in three concentric circles. The first is when you look at digital for within government agencies, the digital capabilities as an enabler, and you look at increasingly how we can all use certain commons, digital commons together, whether you're the Ministry of Transport or the Ministry of Health or the Land Urban Redevelopment Authority. There is a certain base of connectivity, of data, of analytics that you can use and share together. Then it's about being able to build together rather than in silo. I think many of our agencies have over the years built their own systems in silo. So the difficulty and the challenge there is to be able to migrate from that particular architecture where agency A owns the systems belonging to agency A, and rather to move from that to a system where we have commons that we share, and we're all the better for it because of the commons. So that's one level of difficulty. The second level of difficulty is when you get down to the specific things that affect the individual. So you get down to things like transportation, housing, and so on. It is not as if governments are built randomly. They are built for a reason. So there's a housing, there's a statutory board looking after housing, there's a statutory board looking after transport for a very good reason. And there has to be a conversation, a co-ownership with the agency concerned to talk about how I can use digital capabilities to raise their ambition, to make land transportation as best as we can make it using digital capabilities. So it's about that partnership between if you call it a central agency, such as mine, and the agencies responsible for delivering services that would have direct impact on the individual. So that's another layer. And the last layer, as you pointed out, is about bring the whole economy, bring people along. And one very specific, it doesn't answer all the questions, but one very specific aspect of it is the role of government. We've used the term digital infrastructure, but it means, implied in that is a sense that maybe the state has to do a little more in terms of building certain things to allow businesses and economies to grow. But at the same time, you don't want a state that does everything. It's not good for creativity, it's not good for innovation, and a lot of money might be spent on things that are eventually not adopted. So it's also about this trade-off between how much government should be in e-payments, how much the state should be funding a digital identity framework to allow businesses to talk to businesses, for example. And these are questions that are valid ones, that these are challenges that we should, I think are worthwhile to look into as we talk about how we bring everybody, agencies, whole government, citizens and companies along in this journey.
So, yeah, sure. So I thought that was good summary and a structure that's firstly build commons. Secondly, co-own the responsibility for improving the services to the citizens. And the third one is to regularly have a conversation amongst the agencies with the citizens about what may be required and important enabling infrastructure for the citizens and for the other government agencies. So at this point, I'll open up to the floor, but I think Peter here has a question already.
Yeah, can I ask a precursor question to this one? Given what we're all up against, how well do you think how well have you taken the other government agencies with you so far on this journey? Because it'll be a journey. So to this point, how well have you taken them with you? Where are those problems? And related to that, to what extent do we need to take everyone with us on the journey? There was a beautiful story this morning from Georgia about at some point you just get rid of 25,000 policemen because they're corrupt and you start again. And for a lot of us in the technology space, there's a point at which you start greenfield and build upwards again, because there's going to be a lot of resistance to having to re-engineer. Re-engineering can be a losing game at some point. So.
Well, if you look at, if your question is how well, and if I compare it against what we believe the potential of digital technology can, when it is realized, the kind of benefits to society that can be manifested, then we are a distance from being able to fully realize that. When you compare it to what is realistic, as far as the government can push things, I'm not quite sure how well that is. But in terms of being able to imagine what digital technology can do for economy and for people, there's a lot more that can be done. There's a lot more that my colleagues and I would all want to have done a year ago and half a year ago. And it's about working smart at getting it done. It is a tricky one, and it is not just I don't think it's just about the government. I think it's about the entire economy. Your beautiful story of 25,000 policemen. And it's not even about whether we do a smart nation or not. The fact of the matter is, with the change to the workplace brought by digital, there will be disruptions to jobs. For Singapore, I think at a macro perspective, when we look at the demographics of an aging population and so on, we know that there's one force that requires us to be more productive and more efficient, to do more with less people, and there's another force called technology that's allowing us to do that. So at a macro level, the sums may work, but at a micro level, when certain jobs are displaced, for example, it's not as if the 25,000 policemen can become data scientists now, right? So there will be mismatches, and these mismatches will have to be managed with skills training and working together with employers to sort of deal with that. I don't think there's a silver bullet to this. We have a skills future framework, and this is one approach, our key approach to try to have a more adaptive workforce and to keep employment, to sustain employment and employment.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? Anyone? Yes, Christine.
Maybe it's a comment rather than, can you hear me? Maybe it's a comment. Yeah?
Yes.
Does it work? Okay. Maybe it's a comment, but maybe also I'm tired, but I'm got a little bit confused about some of the conclusions. And one of them is you're talking about how to deal with the problem of take-up and adoption. Yeah? But we're talking about disruptive technologies here. And I think we're jumping, to the implementation phase while we haven't been in a decision and experimentation phase where we test, and then based on this testing can take an informed or a more mature decision to do the best, for what you call the public interest. So what I was missing a bit now in these summaries was really, and we know the problems with the compartmentalization, in the silo structures in the public service, and there is resistance to adoption of technology. But when it comes to disruptive technologies, this is another dimension, and I would like to hear a bit more about how you deal with this. Should you be the pioneer? Should you be the first runner, or should you wait for the mainstream?
It's open to the floor. So
If I can start with the answer, at least what we're facing right now, if you're not playing with the technology, and by the time someone figures it out, there might be a space, a light year ahead of you. And that's part of the problem. So everybody needs to be able to participate and play effectively, and be ready, at least as a workforce, as a mentality, as an organizational structure, to take up very quickly. Because imagine, and this is also one of the things I gave a talk, I think, a couple of months ago in the risk assessment and horizon scanning conference, and one of the things that I pointed out is there's almost an arms race going on when it comes to artificial intelligence. So countries are comparing themselves, not companies, and they're investing relatively independently in their R&D and build-up of capacity. And one of the reasons is the moment that you actually have something that resembles, general intelligence, you are very far ahead, and you also put a lot of people at a disadvantage, which is one thing that I wanted to say.
I just wanted to, sorry.
So yeah, just the second thing is when it comes to also automation and artificial intelligence, again, a lot of it is not visible. In a sense, intelligent software and dumb software look the same on the surface. They just act differently in terms of value proposition.
Yeah.
a metaphor for life.
Well, one item that hasn't come up in any of the discussions that I've been in, but might be something to talk about with government, is a number of governments are setting up what people are calling regulatory sandboxes, which is a sort of safe testing ground for experimentation and trialling of technology. So this might, I don't know if anyone else has, I believe Singapore's got a regulatory sandbox, and this might be something that someone else would like to talk about a little bit, but it gives government the opportunity to be able to safely experiment, still be in the game. I think the other second comment is that many of these technologies are already moving very fast, and government needs to keep up because it's going to disrupt government. So I think it comes back to the government's got to figure out how it wants to be disrupted and get there first before someone else does.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent question, right? Because when we say something disruptive, right, meaning that it means that we never predict it to happen. And if something is disruptive, you couldn't plan for it to happen, right? It disrupted us. So I like the comments that the DS has made about disrupting ourselves, about government agencies, and the second comment about open innovation. Because I think that brings two very important points. One is that maybe we should just be ready for disruption. We can't plan for it, but we need to have new structures in governments that is amenable to disruption. It means when a disruption happens, it's not a frown, but we smile at it and say, wow, that's good. But in order for that to happen, the current structures cannot support it. Now, the second part is open innovation. I think that's critical. Meaning that if you look at all the disruption, they are not government-led. Because it's government-led, it's not disruption, right? It's planned. So all the disruption has come from innovation, from the private sector, from companies, right? And you want that to happen because there's real value creation. So open innovation is key. And this morning we had this conversation for a wonderful story. And that the open innovation is not just about being open-minded, but open nations. Meaning that nations should now consider how can we operate in a porous international environment without borders, because the internet has no borders. So when we still operate in the concept of a bordered, warred country, we will be disrupted.
There might be one or two countries that will disagree with you that the internet is
I think we want to be pioneers in applications that are most relevant to you and your business. So the business of government is to serve its people through public services, then you want to be pioneers in that. So just for instance, in artificial intelligence, for example, you can be a pioneer in the sense that you have mentioned, being in the race to be the first to figure out one-shot learning or any of those new things, or you can be a pioneer in terms of using artificial intelligence in the specific application that you want to be involved in. One aspect of artificial intelligence, as with many forms of software, is that it is quite democratized. If you know, there are open libraries, there are toolkits, and so on and so forth. So then it becomes incumbent on government to think how can I use this better to serve the citizenry, and if we need to be pioneering in that regard, even to the extent of breaking down, changing the way we work, the way we organize ourselves, then I think we have to be. But the second aspect is about the sandboxes, and it's about innovation, and it's really about enabling others to pioneer. We have no idea what is the best idea in retail, in banking, and so on and so forth. But if I have a sandbox, I allow ideas to flourish, I allow them to compete, and hopefully the best one will win, hopefully the best one will prosper, it will create lots of jobs for people, and so on and so forth. All the wonderful things that we all want as governments.
Thank you. Yes, there's a question at the back. Tap, tap, tap. If not, switch it on.
Yeah, it's working now. Hi, my name is Taimur. I work for UNDP Regional Hub in Bangkok. So just a quick question. It's actually two questions rolled into one. So the issue of trust and data, I think that was briefly touched upon, where one of you said that the governments aren't as trusted as the private sector or the companies in terms of the management of data. So I think that maybe have to do with the sort of communication strategy aspect as well, because I'm not sure how reliable the private sector is in terms of use of data and so on as well. The other related question is that how are we thinking about technology? For instance, it was also mentioned that Facebook is a free app, but it's not really free. We're giving a lot of data, right? And without our data, it wouldn't work at all, right? But all the profit or the money made, and very large amounts, aren't going back to the people, right, who give the data. So in that sense, when we are talking about jobs being displaced, to what extent what we call now free apps can be something that is that we're instead paid for, right? Rather than it being a free app. I mean, again, that's an interesting play on words, because it's not really a free app. You are giving away quite a bit. So if you could just touch upon these aspects of trust, how we think about technology and so on, and implications for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? We'll take all of them and then we'll get the panel to respond. Yes, there's one question.
Hi, my name is Bernice. I work at Zeroth Labs. So my question actually builds on Taimur's. I'm curious what the panel thinks about, I guess, as companies get more and more data and make more and more money, the power dynamic between companies and countries may get blurred, or would it? So I'm interested in what the panel thinks about possible geopolitical implications of this kind of dynamic and the trend that's going along.
Thank you. Other questions? So what a great question to end the panel with. We've got to talk about trust, free apps, the costs and benefits, and the geopolitics of it all. Anybody wants to take a stab?
question about the geopolitics, because I think the answer is we don't know, and a lot of people are trying to think about what will the world be like when you have very large groups of people being able to organise themselves through technology that cross traditional boundaries and that are able to act outside of what, you know, our traditional sovereign state government systems are. What will the role of government be in a future like that? Will there be governments in the way that we know governments now? And then what kind of world governance structure will there be for a world that's full of these interconnected organisations that are probably not around geography but are around beliefs or interests or religions or other matters like that? So I think there's some pretty big questions that we don't know the answer to, but we need to be exploring. And you know, I think for UNDP, I'm pretty confident that the UN system, as it's currently structured, is absolutely not going to be appropriate for the new future. So, you know, I think you of everyone should be disrupting yourselves.
Sure. Yeah, I think that question about trust and data is $6 million question. And of course, we discussed in the morning as well in our session that first and foremost, the nature of trust varies across different cultures, right? Different countries, some governments are very trusted by the citizenry, some are not, and some trust in the bank, some do not. You know, some trust in Alibaba, and some do not. Right? So, other than the fact it's cultural, there's a common trait that I noted as a technologies and implementing solutions across different culture is that very often I discovered that the trust dimension is mutual. Meaning, in governments whereby the citizenry is trusted, the trust element of the citizens to the government is higher. So, for example, if you look at social media, Facebook, right? Have you ever considered how much trust Facebook gave to the end user? That you load all your data and you know you not do silly things too much too often. So because of that, right, it bridges a relationship with the users of social media. So one element about trust is that it is very mutual, and the challenge with that is that it tears down the old rules of a hierarchical structure of trust that we're used to. How do you explain trust in a peer-to-peer network, for example, except mutual trust? So in these new dimensions that we're talking about, trust therefore is no longer hierarchical. And second dimension, which is about the data, plus the fact that trust now is borderless, which makes it even more complicated. I mean, and then of course we as technologies, we created this horrible word called the cloud, right? You know, cloud, when I translate it to Singapore, it means smoke, you know. I mean, I call it, you throw a lot of smoke because if you can't convince them, you confuse them, you know, I call it the cloud, right? Because not, I mean, how do you build trust in telling people we don't know where your data is, you know, but trust us? It's like I always joke when I involve with young people is that when someone asks you, please trust me, don't trust the person, because trust is really mutual. So how do we create mutual trust? If we can do that, we can build the trust network.
On the mutual trust, I'm pretty sure Facebook can do more damage to my life than me to Zuckerberg's income. So that's one thing. And then the other is the moment you create platforms, which I mean, the basic definition of them is that through them we can interact with each other and build value, but they retain most of that value. Then you know, then we immediately establish a relatively hierarchical relationship, and that's not going to do away with. And there's many, you know, blockchain commons, for example. Yes, it is a possible a model that could do away with part of that, but it's still somewhere in the future. With regards to the very interesting comment with regards to what would happen if you know, corporate data and government data and incentives merge and etc. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, of course, it's difficult to judge when looking at media, but what has been happening, for example, with the U.S. elections is a very interesting example of that. You have incentives aligned in a way that basically, as long as I pay, you don't ask that many questions. And for example, platforms like Facebook can turn into platforms for swinging opinion left and right, depending on, of course, other incentives, which I'm not going to qualify. Then, with regards to trusting governments versus trusting corporates, for me there's a very interesting component there. I don't expect Facebook to knock at my door one day and say, hey, you've been, saying this and doing that. While, for example, historically, in many places, governments have been doing that. So that's also part, and there's the other aspect as well. I mean, there's ways of mining that data either ways, and as long as both parties agree that we don't really talk about it that much, it's fine. It's a working relationship. And I've seen multiple pieces of software which help security organizations, national security organizations, police organizations, deploying bots within Facebook to mine people's data in order to be able to identify if they're potential targets or not. So trust is a very fluid thing. I think a big part of what we need to ask ourselves is what we attach value to. And as long as we don't attach value to our data, our data is not going to be valuable to us, or at least it's not going to be treated like that. And I'm not sure how many of you guys have requested their data sets from Google or from Facebook or from Twitter or from anything. It's a very, especially the ones who are or have some relationship to the European Union, they're already protected under the Act. They're obliged to send you the data that they have on you. It's very interesting to look into and see what the signals are and what judgments can be made through combining and recombining data that are not necessarily direct and linear, because there's a lot of value in that, and that is also why we need to ask ourselves how much do we value our data and what the implications can be. An interesting example is my wife, for example. She tells me, well, why do I need to secure my browsing, and why do I need to be wary of people accessing my Facebook account? Why do you not want me to post everything about our family life? And she never considers, for example, that information mapped over a period of time exposes us, her child, towards interesting risks of the future that are not well understood. For example, and this is the last example I'm going to give, you probably read about the research project that enabled reconstruction of Obama's Obama's face and voice based on deep learning algorithms that you write what you want him to say and he will say it and it will look like it's a real footage. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have enough photos and footage out there to have something like that built on us. What happens with identity and what happens with trust and trust in news or trust in identity when that is a common threat?
I think this is just a limited reply to the question on geopolitics. I do think that one important aspect that governments collectively or singly should pay attention to and have a discourse with the likes of Google and Facebook and so on are the norms of behavior on internet platforms. So if this is not something for governments to think about, then it becomes by default something for the giant conglomerates to think about and to decide. So who decides? Gmail decided that if the content of your Gmail has got something to do with child pornography, that deserves it being escalated to the authorities. But if the content of your mail has something to do with blowing up a bank, for example, that does not get surfaced to the authorities. So that might well be the correct decision. I'm not saying it's a wrong decision, but it is made by Google as a corporate. It is not made by a government. So what about fake news? What about what is acceptable or not to what extent does cyberbullying become like terrible and a criminal offense? Things like that has to be sort of discussed, I think, increasingly more so between governments and with the corporations. And because these corporations span different jurisdictions, I would think that the correct way to do this is to have a collective discussion among governments as well. That we can report. So on the data question, I think we are at a point where there is a lot of value to be reaped from taking data and combining data, a lot of discoveries to be made, a lot of money to be made, a lot of good stuff to be done. But of course, all of us are concerned with the issue of privacy, of course. So it's a trade-off. It depends on the culture. Sometimes in certain countries, even the idea of having a digital number for everybody, not a digital number, a physical number for everybody, is not something that the population will naturally accept. And if you look at the history, you can see that there's a very good reason why there's a rejection from society. So it's about that. It's about building trust in the conversation, and I think fundamentally, people, when they let go of their data, even if they don't benefit monetarily from it, there should be fundamentally a sense that it does no harm to him. I don't know how that is to be implemented in reality, but I think that's something that, in terms of building trust, that ought to be a core principle of giving up your data for something. So that's all I would say.
Okay, I'll be quick. So this is somewhat of an amazing conversation to my ears. The trust question is fundamental, but firstly, trust is not hierarchical. That's called power. That was kind of amazing. And trust is earned. It's not something that's given. It's earned over a period of time. And finally, if governments aren't focused on trust, then shame on you. If you're not focused here, because this is the one bit that is crucially missing. We had a conversation about adoption and disruptive technologies. If we are to reap the benefits of economic transformation and social growth that all of this promises and portends to, then governments have to play the role of bleeding trust into the communities that come online at scale for scope. Otherwise, we're done for. That is the big equation out there right now for all of you. And governments are nowhere to be found in that equation right now. So at the end of the day, I hear people dancing around the multi-stakeholder model, which is what's required for a trusted environment as we go forward. Private sector has its mantra. They will be talking about trusted environments and trusted computing and trusted platforms. Civil society tends to have its idea of what it wants to say. Governments are throwing up their hands right now, as I'm kind of hearing through this discussion, and saying, it's a very difficult equation, we're not sure how to do this. In terms of disruptive technologies, to the earlier question, you want disruptive technology, that's Bernice's question there, which is all of the work right now going focused into ownership of data. That is the big new question, because we do know it's valuable. It is valuable, all of it. And right now, the frameworks, we've got Geneva Convention, Digital Geneva Conventions coming up. We've got a whole frame of ways that we know this stuff has to go seamlessly cross-border. We know there have to be new models for what data jurisdiction is all about. And so there's a lot of work going into how we will reframe so there will be personal ownership of data, and you will be able to value and trade in it and so forth. But that's the real disruptive technology, when we can put the power back in the hands at mass net scale. And the first part is there now. The blockchain equation promises peer-to-peer relationships at scale. That is the beauty of the promise if we could ever get past the fragmentation stage and put blockchain out there at scale. But please don't throw your hands up and say this one's too hard and it's unknown. It's not. It really isn't. Sorry.
No?
I'm not getting invited back.
No, you're going to be invited back for many sessions, I'm sure. Wrap up what we've discussed in about last half hour. I think in response to Christine's questions and the two last questions, there are many reasons why we want to do digital technologies, disruptive technologies. It could be because of survival, or else we'll be disrupted. It could be because we're experimenting, so the idea of regulatory sandboxes. It could be because it's competition. There's an arms race going on. You've got to get in the game. In some cases, it could just be simply because you just want to do a better job serving your citizens. And those are all equally worthy examples. And what the discussion in the last two questions have just suggested is that even as we're entering the age of disruptive technologies, I think it's also time for an age for discussion about ethics, about why we should do certain things or not. Just because technologies allow us to do certain things doesn't mean we should. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And we must be very clear that we're doing this ultimately for the benefit of the society. Right, with that, I wrap up our panel and welcome all of you to thank my panel.